Okay, so today I want to talk about Cossacks, myth and history in the southern steppe. Last time we were super Arctic. Now we're going to move south and talk about this very important in Russian history borderland phenomenon. And perhaps one of the things, sorry about that, um, as I'm closing this other file. One of the things that really strikes me about the history of Cossacks in general is that is perhaps a thematic point about empire. And I think that Cossacks represent an example of a time in history where we see the periphery influencing substantially, arguably, what happens at the center. And here I'm referring to, you'll see in Chester Dunning's interpretation of the time of troubles and the end of the time of troubles. And we kind of see the end of the time of troubles as the beginning of the Romanov dynasty. He suggests that the reason Mikhail Romanov got chosen over other potential options to become the new leaders of Muscovy was because Mikhail Romanov was acceptable to Cossacks. And so we'll talk more about that, and we'll talk about the influence that um, that the Cossack mob had on the way events played out. That Mikhail Romanov, he was in cahoots with them in that camp at Tushino, and that maybe that gave them cover going forward, that they didn't have to worry about retribution from the state. But that I'm getting far ahead of our story. So let's talk about Cossacks. And so here I will take a minute here to play play this video for you. If here, let me about Cossacks. So the video that we just saw, the video that I just showed you of the Soviet dance troupe enacting a vision of Cossack dance that was very much inspired by this, that picture was very much inspired by this very famous painting. And this painting was done in the late 19th century by Ilya Repin. And it is called The Reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Sultan of Turkey. Now, this painting was purchased by Tsar Alexander III. Tsar Alexander III was the penultimate Tsar of Russia. His son, Nicholas, was the last Tsar of Russia who abdicated the throne in 1917. And Tsar Alexander III served at the end of the 19th century. He was Tsar from 1881 to 1894. And he had a reputation as being a very much a mujik, which meant a very masculine Tsar. And he took the throne after his father, Alexander II, who is known as the Great Reformer. Among many other reforms, he ended serfdom in Russia and was assassinated by a terrorist revolutionary group. And when Alexander III came to the throne, he was very interested in making sure that terrorists didn't get him. And he goes down in history as being a very reactionary czar. So on his watch, you could find yourself in a labor camp, the type of which Dostoevsky wrote about in The House of the Dead, for having gone to a college student meeting group with suspect political aims. At any rate, at the time that Alexander III bought this painting, it was the most ever paid for a painting in Russia. And it figures that the nationalistic, patriotic Russian Tsar Alexander III, with his reputation for being such a masculine mujik, would like this painting. It's, after all, very manly, very Russian Cossacks giving Russia's enemy the finger. So this painting, albeit romanticized, depicts an actual historical event. And so here's the story behind this painting, the reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Sultan of Turkey. Now, I should say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next lecture, that in the 15th and 16th century, the Ottoman Turks are gaining ground, quite literally. 1453, they conquer Constantinople, and in Southeast Europe, they make some gains as well. In the 1520s, they're into Hungary and Eastern Europe. So the Ottoman threat is, the Ottomans are an ascendant power, and much of Western Europe is concerned about the Ottoman threat. These geopolitical concerns also get translated and elided with religious concerns about battles between Christians and Muslims. At any rate, Muscovy more or less avoids confrontations with the Ottomans in the 16th and 17th century. It has a sense that it doesn't have the power yet to defeat this enemy, and therefore it avoids confrontation mostly. They do 1677 to 81 have a war with Turkey that ends in a 1681 peace of Bakhchisarai. But for the most part, they don't interact directly. But Cossacks do interact more directly. And this reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks is born of that direct interaction of Cossacks with the Ottoman Sultan. It is set in 1676, exploit the painting, and it exploits the legend of a reply that the Cossacks sent to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Now, there are lots of different Cossack, and they're called hosts. So there were several different Cossack groups that emerged. Often it had to do with the geography of where they lived. There were the Terek Cossacks, there were the Yayak Cossacks that Catherine II just removed from the map after the Pugachev rebellion. And there were perhaps the most famous Cossacks were the Zaporozhian Cossacks. And Zaporozhian Cossacks comes from the Cossacks that Cossacked, and it gets used as a verb, Cossacked along the steppes of southern Ukraine. And Zaporozhye, which means Zaporozhye, kind of beyond the rapids of the Dnieper River, where in one of our first lectures, I referred to an ancient account talking about how Viking traders needed to get their boats out of the water and portage around these rapids. And when they portaged around those rapids, they were very much subject to raids of nomads who said, we'll get them while they're on land. So there's very ancient tradition of kind of trading and raiding in this territory. And the Zaporozhian Cossacks become the Cossacks that kind of exist and rule in this territory, the Cossacks beyond the rapids, beyond Zaporozhye. And they inhabited these lands around the lower Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine. And they had defeated Ottoman Turkish forces in battle. However, and the Sultan Mehmed demanded that Cossacks submit to Turkish rule. And the Cossacks, led by their hetman, that was the Cossack term for their leader in a given host, his name was Ivan Surko, and he replied in an uncharacteristic manner. He wrote a letter to Sultan Mehmed, and this letter was replete with all kinds of insults and profanities. And here, disclaimer, I'm going to use some very bad language as I read to you an excerpt from this letter. So this painting here exhibits the Cossacks' pleasure at striving to come up with ever more base vulgarities. And during, and Ilya Repin, a late 19th century painter, the Cossacks during this period enjoyed tremendous popular sympathy. Repin himself admired them. He wrote, quote, "All that Gogol wrote about them is true. A holy people. No one in the world held so deeply freedom, equality, and fraternity." And so this is an excerpt from the letter that they wrote to Sultan Mahmud IV. The Sultan, first let me back up a little bit. The Sultan wrote this letter to the Zaporozhian Cossacks. And I'm going to, bear with me, I'm going to read the letter because it helps you get a better sense of the rhetoric with which they frame their reply. So Sultan wrote to the Cossacks, "As the Sultan, son of Muhammad, brother of the sun and moon, grandson and viceroy of God, ruler of the kingdoms of Macedonia, Babylon, Jerusalem, Upper and Lower Egypt, emperor of emperors, sovereign of sovereigns, extraordinary knight, never defeated, steadfast guardian of the tomb of Jesus Christ, trustee chosen by God himself, the hope and comfort of Muslims, confounder and great defender of Christians, I command you, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, to submit to me voluntarily and without any resistance, and to desist from troubling me with your attacks." That was the introduction. And if you think that's a little over the top, you should just spend some time reading how 16th century kings and emperors address themselves. The list of titles really goes on and on and on. I do not cease to wonder at the amount of ink they spilt spelling out all their titles. So at any rate, this is how the Cossacks, having received this letter, responded to the Sultan. The reply was a stream of invectives and vulgar rhymes, making a parody of the Sultan's titles that he had listed to them. He wrote, the Cossacks wrote back, quote, "Thou art a Turkish imp, the damned devil's brother and friend, and a secretary to Lucifer himself. What the devil kind of knight art thou that cannot slay a hedgehog with your naked ass? The devil shits and your army eats. Thou son of a bitch will not ever make subjects of Christian sons. We have no fear of your army. By land and by sea, we will battle with thee. Beep, thy mother." It was a bridge too far for me to say before students. "Thou art the Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goat, beep, of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt, Armenian pig, Podolian villain, catamite of Tartary, hangman of Kamenets, and a fool of all the world and underworld, a fool before our God, a grandson of the serpent, and crick in our dick. Pig's snout, mare's ass, slaughterhouse cur, unchristened brow, screw thine own mother. So the Zaporozhians declare thou lowlife. Thou will not even be herding Christian pigs. Now we shall conclude, for we do not know the date and don't have a calendar. The moon, months in the sky, the year in the book, the days the same over here as it is over there. For this, kiss our ass." Boom. Excuse the language. Very offensive language these Cossacks used in their address. Now, in a narrower sense, we can see why Alexander III would really like this, kind of by proxy telling off his enemy. Oh, to associate with a group that can speak so brazenly and really show up the Ottoman rival, which Alexander III is, well, at any rate. But in a broader sense, it is really somewhat ironic that Alexander III would celebrate the Cossacks, who at moments in history regarded the Russian state with the same impunity with which they regard the Ottoman Sultan in that letter. And that's why I think when we think about the history of Cossacks in Russia, we want to work to separate the myths about Cossacks that emerged from the history of Cossacks. And that's so that's kind of where I am coming at it. Here is just because I never want to miss an opportunity to show Ilya Repin, the artist of this painting, his probably most famous painting, The Barge Haulers on the Volga, which he made earlier. And maybe you'll note, well, not to diverge too much, Ilya Repin is very much associated with a group of artists who were interested in progressive social change in Russia. That did not stop him from embracing, in the most romanticized, mythologized terms, the history of Russian Cossacks. it makes me think right now about some of the ideas circulating around Navalny, but I'll stop there in terms of, on the one hand, a kind of anti-corruption agenda, with, on the other hand, some ways of thinking about Russian identity that leaves many people who aren't part of the great Russian identity very concerned about what he might do were he to be at the helm of power. At any rate, so from the Russian perspective, here's a photograph from the early 20th century of a Cossack, even when we have photographic technology. From the Russian perspective, Cossacks have been refashioned as Russia's Orthodox frontier guardsmen. In Ukrainian history, they are regarded as fiercely independent, the democratic founding seed of the Ukrainian nation. Both of these interpretations hold some kernel of validity, but neither convey fully a very complicated history. What they both leave out is that Cossacks rebelled against Poland as they rebelled against Russia. And they, throughout much of their history, in the mid-17th century, Cossacks were looking to establish their independence from the Polish state, and they looked for allies to help them achieve that. In doing so, they experimented with small alliances with the Ottomans, with Moldavians, with Wallachians, with Russians, and they sought aid from anyone who may help, including Tatar's Ottoman Sultan himself. And when these alliances didn't pan out, they appealed. When alliances with the Ottomans and Crimean Tatars did not work out, Cossacks appealed to Russia. And while Orthodox identity was not a strong component of early Cossack identity, the Union of Brest, which created the Uniate Church, brought religion to the fore and pushed Cossacks more towards Orthodoxy in the early 17th century. Their Orthodox faith became a basis for their appeals to Russia. And so this is one of the ways in which Cossack identity really shifted over time. I'll explain more about that. Now, let me kind of come back and talk about myths. I've already kind of mentioned them without pausing. What are some Cossack myths? Cossack myths include that Cossacks were really democratic, that they were independent, that they are representatives of Ukrainian nationality, that they were not agriculturalists, they didn't farm, they did more manly things that involved using weapons on horses, whether it was raiding or defending, etc. So those are some of the myths about Cossack history. Historiographical skews, or kind of the uses of abuses of history over time, include that we don't hear in much Soviet historiography, for example, about how Cossacks were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in traditions that write about them as being these heroic Russian Orthodox frontiersmen. What also gets left out of much Cossack history written in a pro-Cossack tone is the deep anti-Semitism that we find in Cossack history. And that one of the founding and most famous and important leaders of Cossack history, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, also presided over horrendous pogroms against Jews on Ukrainian territory in the middle of the 17th century. So from these images of kind of heroic founders of Ukrainian nationality or stalwart or Russian Orthodox frontiersmen, the history of Cossacks is far more complicated. And here, just kind of going back in time before I start more at the beginning, some more Cossack images. This is a painting of Charles the 12th and the Cossack. Here's the Cossack in his kind of Cossack hat and furs. Ivan Mazepa on the banks of the Dnieper after the Battle of Poltava. And Ivan Mazepa goes down in history as one of the greatest traitors, a Cossack who was in alliance with Peter I and then betrayed Peter I's alliance to help Russia's enemy, Sweden. Ivan Mazepa, however, thought he was looking out for Cossack interests. Here is actually an early a painting that almost feels like a very sunny photograph in the way, the technique. This is a painting of the Cossack guards charging the crowd, and this is a crowd of women and children and civilians in St. Petersburg on Bloody Sunday in January 1905, an event in history that did much to turn popular opinion against the Tsarist government. And so Cossacks, as not just a frontier guard, but now an in the city guard, were part of, were very much doing the bidding of the Russian state. Some of you, if you watched the Sochi Olympics in 2014, they deployed in the area of Sochi kind of Cossack police forces, kind of referencing that romantic mythologized myth of Cossacks as kind of keepers of law and order for the Russian state. And some of these groups were reported to have treated groups from the Caucasus quite poorly during the 2014 Sochi Olympics. Here is a picture of Tsar Nicholas II right here blessing a contingent of a Cossack contingent on the front. So these are just kind of sprinkling our attention with some images of Cossacks throughout time. Okay, so geographically, where are we? We are, here is the Caucasus, and the Crimea is treated poorly there, but here's the Black Sea. We're kind of in this territory down here, the southern steppe and those western borderlands. Here it is again, another vision. This is mostly the geography that we're talking about today, that forest steppe, kind of more steppe down here. And this was both, as I've shown you this map and talked about before, the kind of jurisdiction, if you will, of nomads that also became the place that Cossacks did what Cossacked, and this gets used as a verb, that kind of lived their Cossack life. These are some other, this is taken from a book that even titles it The Wild Country, Cossackdom, 1500 to 1700, that same territory. And it's not, it may sound kind of quaint, the wild country, but that's actually taken from this territory in documents is referred to as the Dikaya Polya, kind of the wild field, the wild, or Dikaya Polya, the wild territory. Here's just another map of Ukraine. We can skip that. Here's a map that, as I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Cossack history, I want you to keep in mind, and that is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is an entity that exists from 1569 till the end of the 18th century, when Russia, Austria, and Prussia come together to dismantle it. But for much of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's early existence, their territory was seen as the territory of much of what is now Ukraine. And Cossacks spent a good amount of time, many of them, not all, the ones more in the West, under the jurisdiction of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were subjects of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So in this complicated history that I've just kind of sprinkled in some pictures here, the history of Cossacks is complicated. Cossacks did work for the Russian state from the 15th century. The first mention of Cossacks working for the Russian state comes in a chronicle entry from 1444. They participated in a campaign against Kazan. Yes, that's over a century before the 1552 campaign where they actually conquer Kazan for good. But as I mentioned before, there's a longer history there. So they did work for the Russian state from the 15th century, but it takes some real selective memory to celebrate Cossacks as being entirely loyal to the Russian state, because we have the example of Ivan Mazepa, who Peter the Great called the greatest traitor ever, who thought he was doing the right thing by his people. And so, so that's kind of just some polls of Cossacks. A take-home point that I'd like you to be aware of: Cossacks play an important role in Muscovite and in Russian history. As we will see, but haven't yet, but we will see, they were very important in the time of troubles. Because they formed to a significant degree the base of false Tsar Dmitri's support. And according to Chester Dunning, it was their voice that was significant in ultimately rejecting other potential czars or kings for Russia and choosing Mikhail Romanov, who they understood to be as both weaker and someone who wouldn't go after the Cossacks in the event of kind of trials or investigations for disloyalty in the wake of the time of troubles. Secondly, Cossacks are very important in Ukrainian history. Third, Cossacks are a borderland phenomenon. We have a group like this to study because we are talking about a territory where no single state could effectively exert its authority. And so in that way, they provide an excellent case study in borderland identities, borderland negotiations, what identity means in places in a borderland place. So that's just kind of preface to say that their history is very layered and quite complicated. So in terms of teasing out Cossack myth and Cossack reality, Cossacks know this, that Cossacks are a phenomenon of the borderland in this area. So you have Muscovy, this state, like a real state that's becoming more powerful. You have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that is a major player, and you have the Ottoman Empire, who is a major player. These are all big states, if not empires. But none of them really wielded their authority all that effectively in these southern borderlands. And that is why it became a place where Cossacks congregated, made their livelihood, and established and struggled to maintain claims of autonomy and authority. So the word Cossack, here's just some more pictures. There's so many pictures, art historical renditions of Cossack. Here's a Polish rendition of a Cossack on duty. Here is a picture of a Cossack wedding by the same Polish artist. Now, let's see. Well, here, I'll just show this picture while I say these few words. So what were Cossacks? Cossack, the word Cossack comes from a Turkic word, a Turkic term that means a free man, a freebooter, a free frontiersman. So that sense of freedom is baked into the word itself. And it's the same root word as for Kazakh, meaning Kazakh, the ethnic root of Kazakhstan. So it can get confusing reading old historical texts where are they talking about a Cossack or a Kazakh here? And here's an important moment. What was the ethnic and religious makeup of Cossacks? the ethnic and religious makeup of Cossacks changed over time. By the 19th century, they get represented as this Slavic Orthodox group. But in the earliest instantiations, they were far more diverse, even including Turks who, for whatever reason, left their circumstances and kind of found a home in the hosts of the southern steppe, or Poles, even Jews, or a variety of different people. So confessionally, religiously, they originally were far more diverse, and in terms of ethnicity, they were far more diverse as well. It was sort of a kind of runaway place, like people that had reasons that they had to leave. They went into the steppe and they found these hosts, and hosts were Cossack groups, and they were democratic. Each host, it was a very male space, and the host chose their atman, who was their leader, an entirely democratic fashion, and then they would make raids and divvy up the booty. And atmans, historians have determined, didn't generally have a long tenure. So we don't want to over romanticize the kind of democratic brotherhood. Like if an atman didn't deliver booty to keep the group satisfied enough, they were ousted pretty quickly. And sometimes that ousting could be quite violent. Also, the Cossacks, it wasn't a 365-day-a-year thing. There were no women there, but many of these Cossacks seasonally went home to women that lived in villages and farmed and had families. And Cossacking was something that they did seasonally. Now, by the 16th century, by the time of the time of troubles, and then into the 17th century, Cossacks are full-on associated with Orthodoxy. And they are full-on associated with, well, kind of Russian and Ukraine. The Turkic elements, or the Mongol Turkic elements, or Polish elements, or Jewish elements in Cossackdom have entirely fallen away. So why is that? Kind of two reasons. In the late 1500s, perhaps as part of the Little Ice Age, Russia experiences, as you'll hear me talk more about, a series of crop failures. And there is real economic hardship, such that peasants who live on estates of larger lords have a hard time getting by. And those lords even start kicking them off the estates because they know that they have an obligation to make sure people don't go hungry in hard times. And rather than fulfill that obligation, they'd rather get rid of these people. And some escape for their own, leave for their own purposes. Russian documents in the 16th century, we see villages come, and they're described as pustatoy, empty, empty, empty. Many people just left given the hardship. Where did they go? Many of them fled. Some of them fled into Siberia, and many of them fled southward to try and find some sort of living there. And so in what was a perhaps more mixed demographic became increasingly Russian as Russians fled economic hardship. And then with economic hardship, we start to see a hardening of serfdom, or that is peasants who used to go and they would live on a lord's estate, they lose that right to leave. And when they don't have that right to leave, then they're not free peasants, they're serfs. And according to Paul Bushkovich in his concise history of Russia, one of the reasons, one of the catalysts for more Slavic peasants moving southward and seeking a different way of life in Cossackdom is in retaliation for that imposition of serfdom. And so in the late 16th century, that those kind of, maybe we might say, socioeconomic pushes change the demographic of Cossackdom in these southern borderlands to be more Russian dominated. And then there's another religious part of the story too. We'll talk more about this, but if you recall, Russian Orthodox, Poland, more Latin Christian, Lithuania, a mix, of Orthodox and Latin Christians. And then once the Reformation begins, we also have some people of Reformed faith and Orthodoxy. So Polish Lithuania is more of a religious mix. Russia is Orthodox. And so alongside that, those kind of religious circumstances, there's geopolitical competition here. And in the 16th century, Lithuania especially sees Muscovy as a threat coming for it. Remember, we heard about Andrei Kurbsky, who went and left and joined the Polish Lithuanians, and Ivan didn't like that sort of thing. And so in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, they see Muscovy as a threat. And they also see that the majority of peasants in the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth are Orthodox. And they are uncomfortable with these circumstances where they rule over people in a world where there are no atheists. Religion is very important to identity. And so they rule over people whose faith has them looking to the Patriarchate in Muscovy as a spirit for spiritual leadership and guidance. And they don't like that. And so in 1596, the Union of Brest forms the Uniate Church. And I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again. The Uniate Church, I personally see it as a quite cynical move in history, where they basically say, we're going to create this church. You can still be Orthodox. We're not really changing anything, except you're going to call the Pope in Rome, instead of the Patriarch in Moscow, your spiritual leader. The intention is political, to not have its people, the bulk of its demographics, looking to Moscow as a leader. In short, although the Uniate, or known as the Greek Catholic Church, exists to this day, in short, it largely backfires. And many people kind of dig in with their sense of orthodoxy. And we start to see an association between, we see a real association between Cossacks and defenders of orthodoxy emerging in Ukraine in the 17th century. So those are kind of two pretty drawn out explanations for how this thing of these freemen on the steppe that form together in these democratic hosts that initially have a quite more diverse identity, in the late 16th, by the very early 17th century, come to be seen as Russian or Ukrainian, and Orthodox, and defenders of orthodoxy. So that there's this evolution in what a Cossack is. And I kind of make a point of this to say that Cossacks are not timeless. It is hard to pinpoint where they emerge, but like all things, they have a beginning and a history, and they're not the same thing at any given moment that they exist in. And the other things, let me show you this slide instead. So there I kind of talked about cultural identity in terms of ethnicity and religion. And now I want to take a few words and I want to talk about the geopolitical world of the Cossacks, and develop on this idea. They see themselves as independent. Were they independent? In the 16th century, various Cossack hosts begin building forts and settlements. These forts and settlements are called the Sik. They get by raiding, and some trade and raiding and divvying up that booty amongst themselves. That's kind of their modus operandi of economic life. Now, in doing so, who are they trading and raiding? They are often trading and raiding Ottomans. They'll even take their boats all the way to Constantinople, that very rich city, and the shores there. And what they do is basically they give the Russian state plausible deniability. Throughout the 17th century, we see throughout the 17th century, we have interactions between Muscovy and the Ottomans where the Ottomans are saying, your people did this. And the Muscovite Tsar writes back, oh, those aren't my people. Sorry about that, but they're not mine. And yet there are some connections between Muscovy and the Cossack hosts. And similar things happen in Poland. So what was their relationship to the Russian government? We see developing a symbiotic relationship. We see developing a relationship where they serve the Russian state on ad hoc missions. Oh, will you accompany this embassy that's on its way to Persia, being guides, that sort of thing. And hiring them as mercenaries. I told you the first time we see this happening is in 1444, is the first mention, but they'll continue to do that. The Russian state will recruit in an ad hoc basis Cossacks to help fight off Tatar attacks. And and then the Cossacks, though, they're to say they're out for themselves, they will attack Polish estates and Muscovite estates and Ottoman places and assets as well. And so all the powers down there, the Ottomans, Poland, Muscovy, they all hire Cossacks as mercenaries. It isn't just Russia. But in the 16th century, we start seeing them building their own forts. Women cannot come. They're led by the Atman, as I said, who is chosen by a democratic vote. And I also want to, and it's the establishment of those six that kind of provide the fodder whereby Cossacks see themselves as very as independent. And different hosts get developed: Zaporozhian, Don, Yek, Terek, Bratislav, Kiev, Chernihiv. So we have this symbolic relationship. So those are some of the ways in which they are independent. They choose who they work for, and they call themselves autonomous. But there's also this story alongside of dependence. So on the one hand, you could say they're choosing their own employers, but on the other hand, they're working for this state, and they are getting gunpowder and then money and other things back from the state. So they are becoming dependent on the Russian state. And in Muscovy, they will in 1580. Let me stay on the Russian service. So different Cossacks hosts agree to come into Russian service. 1570, the Don Cossacks, and they even get a uniform, a blue tunic with red stripes and a red crown blue. So they have kind of a uniform as this regiment for the Russian state. The Ural Cossacks sign on to the Russian state and get a uniform in 1571. The Terek Cossacks in 1577. Kuban, much later in the 19th century, Orenburg Cossacks in the 18th century, and there's some other groups. So Cossacks groups kind of become regiments in standing service to the Russian state. That is a more independent, that is more an example of dependency versus being independent, I think. And then in the Polish state, they also become dependent, although in Poland, the story is a little bit different. Poland creates a Cossack registry where those on the list have certain privileges in the Polish state, not just that they're paid, but they have kind of social privileges about carrying weapons and things like that. But you have to be a registered Cossack to enjoy those privileges. In 1582, there are 500 Cossacks on the Polish registry. By 1649, it's expanded to 40,000. Then they have it a year later in 1650, they have it down to 20,000. And it is perhaps no surprise that it is as the Polish state halves the number of Cossacks that receive regular privileges from it, that you have a major Cossack rebellion where they rise up fighting against the Polish state, and shortly thereafter make an alliance with the Muscovite state to get free from Poland. Right? So these things are connected. Now also the existence of the Polish registry, the ways in which you have this not all Cossacks make it onto the Polish registry. And not only this, but this is one of the main reasons why you start to see Cossacks having class distinctions among themselves, and which goes very much counter to one of these Cossack myths about them being kind of egalitarian and democratic in their midst, that all in the sick are equal. That isn't how it really played out. And you do see class differences emerging among them. So this is just kind of an introduction, although as you see, I've already kind of spent a good amount of time talking about the ways that the reality of Cossackdom in the early modern southern borderlands is much different from the romanticized, mythologized versions of Cossackdom. So these are some things I've said. They start serving the states, and they have their history with the Muscovite state. Now let me leave behind the relations with Ottomans and Crimeans and Poles and just focus on the history of Cossacks and Muscovy. So they start being in regular service. They kind of give Muscovy, as I said, plausible deniability, when it's a way for, without directly engaging the Ottomans, they can sort of, thumb their noses and hassle Ottomans. And then when the Ottomans say, yo, Tsar, what are you doing? The Tsar can say, I don't know what you're talking about. They're not my guys. Even though they're getting aid and gunshot and gunpowder and weapons from Muscovy. But here's one example that I think is a fascinating example to hone in on in history. Now, in 1637, a group of Cossacks took a fort at the Sea of Azov. So right at the tip of the Sea of Azov. Let's see if we can get to a map here. So here, the Azov Sea. There was a fort, an Ottoman fort right about here, and some Cossacks capture it. And so they're like, this is great. The Tsar will be so proud of us. And they send a messenger to Moscow and saying, hey, Tsar, aren't we great? We took this Ottoman fort. We think you'll be so happy for us. How would you like to take over running it and just sort of reward us for it? And Moscow, they said, oh, look at this. And they kind of run some numbers thinking the Ottomans are coming back for this. What is it going to cost us to hold on to this? And they take a look at it and they say, we'll pass. Thanks, but no thanks. So importantly, this is the case for those people, when you hear people say, Russia just wants to expand, expand, expand. That's all it's ever interested in. This moment in 1637 is an example of Russia kind of being quite savvy and considered and making a choice not to expand at every opportunity. And they say thanks, but no thanks to the Cossacks that captured this Ottoman fort for them. And the Cossacks end up pretty much abandoning the fort, and the Ottomans get it back. It's going to be the very end, 1696, before Russia will capture that part of Azov. So that was that's one example of an instant in the history of the relations between Cossacks and Muscovy, and an example that shows that Muscovy isn't an inveterate expander. In 1654, let me hold off on this history. We'll get to this, but basically in 1654, the Cossacks make a treaty with Muscovite to form an alliance, and they think that they're forming an alliance, but Muscovy thinks that they're agreeing to become eternal subjects of Muscovy. And it is the source, this 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav is the source of much historical misunderstanding and contentions. I'll skip over Hayjack right now, basically where they establish an alliance with the Poles, kind of showing that clearly they didn't think they were becoming eternal subjects of the Russian Tsar in 1654, if just a few years later they think they can establish an alliance with the Poles. And then the story of Mazeppa in the context of the Great Northern War, Russia versus Sweden. That war goes from 1700 to 1721. And Mazeppa, the Cossack who feels like Peter's not delivering on his promise, switches sides, and Peter thinks there's never been a worse betrayal. So these are all kind of examples where we see a lot of misunderstanding in the historical record. Cossacks, we're going to hear about, here's a 19th century, again, all these great paintings, real nationalistic, dramatic, colorful, that come to us from Russian artists in the late 19th century. Here is Surkov's rendition of the conquest of Siberia by Yermak. Yermak is a Cossack. We're going to talk about him, who pretty much escapes. He knows that Ivan IV is coming for him, and he escapes to Siberia and takes up as like the Stroganov's private security contingent. So Cossacks have a role in the conquest of Siberia. And then in short, just I'll take a few more minutes. Cossacks we have a history of Cossacks posing major rebellions in Russian history. So here's back to that irony of that also reactionary Tsar Alexander III, who's celebrating Cossack history and how they were really willing to really tell the Ottoman Tsar off, the Ottoman Sultan off, and he really liked that. But it really required a selective memory of ignoring this history of Cossacks not towing the Russian line by a long shot. So the seizure of power, we're going to talk about this, the seizure of power by Dmitry Otrepov, the false Dmitry, could not happen without Cossack fighters. Yermak is very much on the outs of the Russian state before he succeeds in rehabilitating himself before Ivan IV, after he's led the conquest of Siberia. In 1606 and 1607, amidst the time of troubles, there is a major Cossack rebellion led by a Cossack, Bolotnikov. He is originally a slave who escapes, is captured, escapes and is put in charge of a Cossack unit. So, and he leads a rebellion against the Russian state. Khmelnytsky, Khmelnytsky more leads an uprising against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and has somewhat troubled relations with Muscovy as well. It's this example, and he's a very complicated figure. We'll say a bit more about him, but there's another example of a Cossack who, has a big army and is doing Cossack bidding. In the 1670s, a major rebellion against the Russian state is led by the Cossack Stenka Razin. Stenka Razin, 1670-71, he manages to march through the south north of Azov and really mount a challenge, kill lots of Russian leaders, and mounts a real challenge to the Russian state. He actually goes down in history as an absolute hero. There are Russian folk songs sung all the way to the end of Imperial Russia about Stenka Razin. Here I'm gonna actually show you just this one quick little historical find. I went to a conference a few years ago where a Swedish scholar, Irina MWIR, presented a paper, and it was fascinating. So Stenka Razin was executed. He was captured and he was executed, and in 1671. Irina MWIR went through all these archives in Europe, and she found press sheets, kind of the earliest versions of newspapers, where there were pictures of Stenka Razin's execution, but alongside him was his brother being executed in the pictures that are published in the Proto-European newspapers of 1671 as well. And she did the historical detective work to determine that essentially the Russian state kind of sent out kind of early news press release about this happening, but then at the last minute they changed their mind and they executed Stenka Razin individually. But that correction didn't make it to Western European powers, and that is why Irina MWIR found in various Western European archives pictures of another man being executed alongside Stenka Razin in 1671. I just think that's a kind of fascinating example of historical detective work, where we just kind of understand a little bit better the workings of the traveling of news and communications between Muscovy and the rest of Western Europe, perhaps. The And then kind of the final major Cossack rebellion. And I think it's fair to say that from the time of this rebellion in 1774-75 until, well, the rise of terrorist movements in the second half of the 19th century, we don't see major challenges to Russian state authority. Discuss. But anyway, so just to put on your radar screen, because one lecture on the history of Cossacks would be remiss if it didn't mention Emelian Pugachev, who led the Pugachev revolt in 1773 to 1774, and then he was executed in 1775 after he was caught. He led a revolt that again kind of shook and threatened the Russian state, perhaps like no other rebellion had, certainly in anyone's living memory. It was during the reign of Catherine II, who very much wanted to be an enlightened czar. But as Pugachev moved through Russia, and these are all various sites of interactions, battles, or events in his life that you can find at this website, it really kind of was one of those moments that made Catherine challenge how enlightened and gentle as a ruler she wanted to be. Her predecessor, Elizaveta Petrovna, had kind of declared that Russia would no longer conduct executions, but Pugachev, at Catherine's behest, was publicly executed for his rebellion. And his rebellion is actually captured in Pushkin. You've maybe heard of a famous poet, whatnot, poet and mastered all kinds of genres. Pushkin also wrote a history of the Pugachev rebellion, in which through his connections, he kind of got into the Russian archives and studied up most of the paper that they had about it. So here's a slide I hadn't shown you yet. These are some Cossack uniforms: a Don Cossack, Lithuanian officer, Kuban, some various uniforms. Here comes back a picture of our Cossack photograph of an early 20th century Cossack. And with that, we will wrap up our introduction to the history of Cossacks, knowing that when we study the time of troubles, Cossacks are major players.